My life completely changed the day I helped my 49-year-old neighbor while his wife was away. I never expected that a small act of kindness would turn into something much more significant, but that's exactly what happened. Before that day, my world was pretty normal. Work, some time with friends, the occasional quiet evening. I didn't think much about my neighbors. They were just the people who lived next door, nothing extraordinary. Then there was Richard, my neighbor. I'd seen him around for years, but we'd only exchanged casual hellos and waves. He lived in a well-kept house, always mowing the lawn, keeping things neat. His wife, Emily, would come and go, often leaving him alone for days or even weeks at a time. I always thought they had one of those marriages where things just ran smoothly and nothing ever really changed. But that all shifted when I noticed something one afternoon while I was sitting on my porch. The sun was just starting to set, casting golden light across the street, and I was sipping on a cold drink, letting the cool breeze wash over me. That's when I saw Richard, sitting on his porch by himself, holding a drink in his hand, staring off into the distance. I had seen him like this before, quiet, alone, but something about today felt different. It was as if the silence around him was heavier than usual, like he was carrying something he couldn't put down. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the more I looked, the more it felt like he was waiting for something. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like he wasn't just thinking about random things. He looked lonely, and that was something I understood deeply. I had been lonely too in my own way. For the next few days, I found myself looking over at Richard's house more often. Sometimes I'd catch him sitting on the porch, staring off into space, his expression distant. Other times, he was busy with the yard work, but it always felt like there was something beneath the surface, something he wasn't saying out loud. One evening, after a few days of noticing this pattern, I decided to act. I didn't want to be nosy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion, and before I could second-guess myself, I walked across the street to his house. When I knocked on the door, it felt like time slowed down. I wasn't sure what to say or what to expect, but I was determined to do something. Richard opened the door, and his eyes widened in surprise. For a brief second, there was an awkward silence, and I almost turned away. But then he smiled. "Well, hello, Kyle," he said, his voice warm but with a trace of surprise. "Hey, Richard," I said, forcing a smile. "I thought I'd bring over some wine. Thought you might like a little company." He hesitated for a moment, but then stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. "You're very kind, thank you. I've been a bit of a recluse lately." I walked in, feeling a bit nervous but also relieved that he hadn't turned me away. His house was exactly what I expected, neat, well-maintained, and cozy. But it also felt quiet in a way that made me realize just how much time Richard spent alone. "Would you like a glass?" he asked, grabbing a couple of glasses from the cupboard. "Sure," I replied, watching as he poured the wine. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, like he was lost in his own thoughts. As we sat down, Richard let out a sigh and took a sip of his drink. "It's not often I have company. Emily's been gone for a few days. It's different without her." I nodded, understanding more than I cared to admit. "I get it. Sometimes the silence feels louder when you're alone." Richard looked at me, his expression softening. "It does. You think you can handle it, but then you realize how much you miss the noise, the presence of someone else." We sat there, sipping our wine, and for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel uncomfortable. It was easy, almost natural. We talked about our lives, our work, and the things we enjoyed. Richard shared stories about his younger years, and I found myself opening up too. It felt like we were both unloading some of the weight we had been carrying in our own lives. By the time the wine was gone, the night had grown quiet and still. Richard turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this, Kyle," he said, almost as if talking to himself. "It's just, lately, I've been wondering if I missed something, or maybe if I've been living for the wrong reasons." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. I could feel the vulnerability in his words, and I knew that it was something important, something that had been on his mind for a while. The night was growing deeper, and the more we talked, the more I realized that Richard wasn't just lonely. He was seeking something. He didn't just want company. He wanted to feel something again. Something more than just the passing days and the routine of life. The more we spoke, the clearer it became that the emotional weight he carried was not just about his wife being away, but about a lifetime of choices and the spaces left unfilled. "Sometimes, I wonder if I've made the right choices," Richard said, his voice quieter now, almost like a confession. "I spent so much time focusing on the work, on being the perfect husband, on keeping up appearances, but now, with Emily gone, I'm not sure what any of it was for." I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, something raw and open. I'd known him for years, but in this moment, he seemed like a completely different person. One who was questioning everything he had once believed. I could feel the heaviness in the air between us, but I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure how to respond to someone so deeply entrenched in regret, in a sense of lost time. I wanted to offer something, some kind of comfort, but the truth was, I didn't know what that was. Instead of speaking, I sat quietly, letting him process his own words. The silence stretched between us again, but it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. Richard seemed more at ease, more comfortable with the weight of his own thoughts. His gaze shifted to me, his eyes searching mine for something. Maybe answers, or maybe just someone who understood. "You ever feel like that, Kyle?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Like you've been living for someone else? Following a path that wasn't yours?" I paused, considering the question. I was young, only 24, and I hadn't had the same life experiences as Richard, but I understood the feeling of being lost. I understood the feeling of living in the shadows of expectations, both from others and from myself. Maybe I didn't have decades of life behind me like he did, but I could see how easy it was to get caught up in the grind and forget what really mattered. "I think we all get lost sometimes," I said slowly. "We get so caught up in doing the right thing, in meeting everyone else's expectations, that we forget to ask ourselves what we actually want." Richard's eyes softened, and he leaned back in his chair, taking a long drink of his whiskey. He didn't say anything for a while, and I could see him thinking about what I'd said. I wasn't sure if my words were comforting or if they just made him reflect more deeply, but I could feel that we were connecting on some level, even if it was just through shared thoughts of doubt and confusion. "You're wise for someone your age," Richard said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. I smiled, unsure if I was wise or just pretending to have it all figured out. Maybe I just understand what it's like to feel lost, to feel like there's more to life than what we see in front of us. Richard let out a soft laugh, a small, genuine sound that seemed to lift the heaviness between us. "Maybe you do," he said. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for, but I'm starting to think maybe I've been looking in all the wrong places." I didn't know what to say to that, but I knew that Richard wasn't just talking about his marriage anymore. He was talking about his whole life. I didn't know what he needed, but I knew that, in this moment, he needed someone who would listen, someone who would be there without judgment. After a while, the conversation shifted. We talked about simpler things, movies, music, our favorite foods. But even in those lighter topics, there was a new depth, a subtle but undeniable shift. It was like the walls that had kept us distant all these years were slowly coming down. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I enjoyed Richard's company. There was something about him that was so different from anyone I had known. He wasn't flashy or loud. He wasn't trying to be anything he wasn't. There was an authenticity in him, a quiet strength that drew me in. As the evening wore on, Richard looked at me again, his expression more serious this time. "I want to thank you for this, Kyle," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I haven't had a conversation like this in a long time. It's nice to be heard." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wasn't expecting a thank you. I wasn't expecting anything. But as I sat there with him, I realized that, in some small way, we were both getting something we hadn't known we needed. "You don't have to thank me," I said, my voice low. "I'm just glad to be here." Richard smiled, and for the first time that evening, I saw a lightness in his eyes. It was like a weight had been lifted just a little. We didn't need to speak anymore. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding that neither of us had to explain. Over the next few days, things between Richard and I felt different. We had crossed some invisible line in our conversation, something that made everything between us shift, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. Our evening talks on the porch became something I looked forward to every day. It was as if we were two people who had been circling each other for years, and now, at last, we were seeing each other clearly. I found myself drawn to his quiet presence, the way he carried himself. He wasn't the loud, boisterous type, but there was something magnetic about the calm confidence he exuded. His gentle laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about something he was passionate about, it made me feel like I was seeing the man beneath the surface for the first time. And every time we spoke, I couldn't help but notice how easy it was to be with him. It felt like we understood each other in a way no one else did. It wasn't just the conversations that changed. It was everything. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, something that neither of us needed to name. It was in the way Richard would look at me, in the pauses between our words, in the small gestures. A touch on the arm, a lingering glance, a brief smile that said more than words ever could. One evening, as the cicadas sang their familiar song in the background, Richard invited me inside again. His wife, Emily, was away visiting her family, and it had become a kind of unspoken ritual for me to stop by, to spend time with him while he was alone. At first, I thought it was just the loneliness that drew him to me, but now I realized it was something more. He was beginning to open up in a way I hadn't expected. We sat in his living room, sipping our drinks. The air between us felt thick with something unspoken, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. It wasn't the same casual friendship we had before. This was different. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," Richard said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was an intensity in it that made my heart skip a beat. About living for others, about missing out on what I wanted. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. "And what do you want, Richard?" I asked softly, trying to keep my voice steady. He met my gaze, his eyes searching mine as if he were looking for something he couldn't quite put into words. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his voice low. "But I think I'm ready to find out." My chest tightened at his words. There was something in the way he said it that made me realize how much he had been holding back for so long, how much he had been waiting for the right moment, the right person, to help him figure it out. Before I could say anything, Richard set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "I know this might sound strange, but I feel like I found something in you, Kyle. Something I didn't expect." I could feel the weight of his words, and my pulse quickened. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I couldn't deny the way my heart raced whenever he looked at me like that. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid to hear the answer, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know. Richard smiled faintly, his gaze softening. "I mean that you've made me feel seen. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm just playing a part. I feel real with you." His words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had never expected this, never imagined that Richard, of all people, would be the one to make me feel like this. It was both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. "I feel the same way," I finally admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "I didn't expect to feel so comfortable with you, but it's more than just that. It's like, we get each other, you know?" Richard nodded, his expression serious now. "Yeah, I know exactly what you mean." There was a long pause, and the air between us seemed to grow even heavier. The connection between us was undeniable now, and I wasn't sure what would happen next. But as I looked at him, I realized I didn't want to walk away from this. I didn't want to pretend like nothing was happening between us anymore. Something had changed. As if reading my thoughts, Richard stood up slowly, walking over to where I was sitting. He stopped just in front of me, looking down at me with those same soft, searching eyes. I think I've been wanting this for a long time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know how to let myself. I could feel the warmth of his body so close to mine, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I had no idea what he meant exactly, but I knew, in that moment, that everything was different. There was no turning back from this. And part of me didn't want to. Richard's words hung in the air between us, thick with meaning. I could feel the distance between us shrinking, the space once filled with hesitation now slowly vanishing. For a moment, neither of us moved, but I could sense the shift happening in the silence. Everything felt charged, like the tension in the room was waiting for something to break, something to happen. Richard took a step closer, and without a word, his hand reached out, resting gently on my shoulder. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a shock of warmth through me. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. It was like my body had reacted before my mind could catch up. I looked up at him, his eyes dark and full of something unspoken. I could feel it then, a magnetic pull between us that was impossible to ignore. "Kyle," Richard said softly, his voice low but firm. "I didn't expect this. Not from you, not from me." He paused, looking down at me with a vulnerable expression. "But here we are, and I don't want to pretend that nothing's happening." The air around us felt heavy, as though the weight of our unspoken thoughts and emotions were pushing us together. I couldn't help but feel the same way. Something had changed in me since that first night we sat on his porch, talking about life and everything in between. Something had shifted, and now, with his hand on my shoulder, I knew that we couldn't go back to the way things were. "I don't want to pretend either," I said quietly, my voice trembling just slightly. The words felt like a confession, like I was finally admitting something I had been hiding from myself. "This feels real, Richard. I don't know what it is yet, but I feel it too." Richard's gaze softened, and he took another step closer, his hand slowly sliding from my shoulder to my arm. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but look up at him, my heart racing. He looked at me for a long moment, as though he were searching for something in my eyes. Some kind of confirmation, some kind of answer. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand brushing against his. I didn't know why I did it, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His fingers closed around mine, and for a moment we just stood there, connected in a way that neither of us had expected. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a moment suspended in time, as though everything was waiting for us to decide what came next. Richard let out a soft sigh, his eyes never leaving mine. "Kyle," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been wanting this for a long time, but I didn't know how to say it, how to make it real." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met in a kiss that was slow and tentative at first, like we were both testing the waters, unsure of what was happening but unable to stop. Richard's lips were warm, and the moment they touched mine, it was as if everything else faded away. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. There was just us. The kiss deepened, and I felt Richard's hands slide to my waist, pulling me closer. The warmth of his body against mine made my heart race, and I could feel the heat between us growing with every second. It was a kiss that spoke of everything we hadn't said out loud, everything we had been avoiding. It was messy, unrefined, but it felt real. It felt like we were finally letting go of all the walls we had built. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. I looked up at Richard, my chest rising and falling with each breath, my heart pounding in my ears. His eyes were dark with something I couldn't quite name, but it was clear that he felt the same pull I did. We didn't need words to understand that. "I don't know what happens next," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm not sorry for this." I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Neither am I," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "I don't know where this goes either, but I don't want it to stop." We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other, the weight of everything that had just happened settling around us. Neither of us knew what the future held, but we both knew that whatever it was, we were in it together. There was no turning back now. The connection between us had already shifted, and there was no way to go back to the way things were. As Richard pulled me into another kiss, deeper and more urgent this time, I felt like I was finally letting go of the fears I had carried for so long. I didn't have to figure it all out right now. We didn't have to have all the answers. All we had to do was let ourselves feel what was happening between us. And in that moment, that was enough. The night stretched on in a haze of warmth and intimacy. When we finally pulled apart, I didn't want to let go. I had never imagined that something like this would happen. Not with Richard, not with anyone. But now, as we sat together, side by side, on his couch, I couldn't deny the connection between us. It was like we had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Richard's arm was around my shoulders, and I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine. His presence grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. His hand brushed through my hair as we sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the night settling in. "I've never felt like this before," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not in years, anyway." I turned my head slightly to look at him, and I saw the same vulnerability in his eyes that had been there when we first talked about our regrets and desires. There was no pretending now, no more hiding behind walls. I had seen the real Richard, the one who longed for more, who wanted something deeper than the surface life he had lived. And I too had let down my guard. I had let myself feel, let myself be seen. "I think I felt this way for a while," I admitted quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how to name it." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "I didn't either. But tonight feels different. Like maybe we've both been waiting for something to change." I didn't know what to say to that. It was true. We had both been waiting for something, and now that it was here, I wasn't sure where it would lead. But in that moment, I didn't care about the future. I just cared about what was happening now, about the connection we had built and the trust that was growing between us. As the night wore on, we talked about everything and nothing. We talked about our pasts, our hopes for the future, and the moments in life that had shaped us. There was a sense of ease between us, like we had been doing this forever. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so comfortable, so at peace with someone. Eventually, the conversation slowed, and we sat in silence again. Richard's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt a surge of warmth spread through me. It was a simple touch, but it felt like a promise. A promise that we would figure this out together, that whatever came next, we would face it as one. As the night drew to a close, Richard led me to the guest room. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. We had crossed that line, and now it felt like we were starting something new. Something that was uncharted, but still full of possibilities. "I'm not sure what this is, Kyle," Richard said softly as we stood in the doorway of the guest room. "But I want to see where it goes." I smiled, my heart racing in my chest. "Me too." And with that, he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lonely. I felt hopeful. I felt like something had changed inside me, something that couldn't be undone. The next morning, the sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. I woke up slowly, stretching as I came to, and immediately, I felt the emptiness of the bed beside me. Richard was already up, and the absence of his presence hit me more than I had expected. I stood up and walked into the living room, where I found Richard sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. He looked up when I entered, and his face softened with a smile. There was a quiet understanding between us now, an understanding that didn't need words. "Good morning," Richard said, his voice gentle, the warmth of his smile reaching his eyes. "Good morning," I replied, my voice a little more uncertain than I intended. But as I stood there, looking at him, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of what had happened between us. I wasn't afraid of where it might go. The uncertainty was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. I felt lighter somehow. Richard motioned toward the counter, where a fresh pot of coffee Saturday. I made some coffee. Thought you might want a cup. I nodded, walking over to the counter and pouring myself a cup. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was different. It was like we were both trying to figure out what had just happened, what this meant for us. I've been thinking about everything, I said, breaking the silence. About last night, about us. Richard turned to me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I wondered if he was thinking the same thing. Me too, he said, his voice soft. I didn't expect any of this, Kyle. But now I don't know how to go back. Neither did I. But maybe, for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to go back. I wanted to see where this would take us, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Because something about being with Richard felt right, felt real in a way I had never experienced before. The morning passed quietly, and as we sat together, drinking our coffee, I realized that this was just the beginning of something new, something neither of us could have predicted. And even though I didn't know what the future held, I felt a sense of calm, knowing that whatever came next, we would face it together. As the days passed, Richard and I settled into a new rhythm. The mornings were quieter, more peaceful, and we began to slip into a comfortable routine. Each time I crossed the street to visit him, it felt like we were writing the pages of a new chapter, one that neither of us had expected to begin. The awkwardness from the night before had melted away. We would sit on his porch, sharing stories, laughing over small things, and sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, as if the world outside had paused. It wasn't just about the connection anymore. It was about the comfort we found in each other's presence. I was beginning to understand the depth of what was happening, and honestly, I was both excited and terrified by it. The weight of this new relationship hung in the air, unspoken but always present. But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the questions that lingered in the back of my mind. Richard was married, after all, and while Emily was away, I couldn't ignore the implications of what we had started. I knew Richard's wife would eventually return, and I wasn't sure what would happen when she did. Would everything between us change? Would I have to step back? I wasn't sure what I was expecting from this, or even what Richard was expecting. I had always assumed that relationships had clear paths, that there was a map to follow, but now, with Richard, it felt like we were navigating uncharted waters, and no one had prepared me for this kind of uncertainty. One evening, as I sat with Richard in his living room, the weight of it all finally got to me. I could feel the tension creeping up my spine, the unspoken questions bubbling to the surface. Richard noticed the shift in me immediately. He looked at me, his brow furrowing in concern. "What's on your mind, Kyle?" he asked, his voice gentle but knowing. He had a way of seeing right through me, of understanding when something was off. I hesitated, unsure of how to put my thoughts into words. I don't know what happens when your wife comes back. When Emily gets home, I said slowly, my voice trembling with uncertainty. I don't want to do something that would hurt you or her. I'm just not sure where this is going. Richard's gaze softened, and he set his drink down on the table. I've been thinking about that too, he said quietly. It's not easy, Kyle, but I can't pretend like nothing's happening between us. I can't deny what I feel, what's been happening. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped in front of him. But I also don't want to hurt anyone, especially not Emily. She's been with me for a long time. The weight of his words sank in, and I felt a surge of emotion in my chest. I wasn't sure what to say. I don't want to mess things up, I said quietly, my voice low and fragile. But I also don't want to walk away from this. From you. Richard's eyes met mine, and there was an understanding between us. It wasn't a solution, and it wasn't a promise. But there was an honesty in the air that made me feel like I wasn't alone in this confusion. We'll figure it out, Richard said firmly, his voice steady. I'm not asking for you to make any decisions now. Just be here with me and we'll take it one step at a time. We'll figure it out together. And with those words, something inside me settled. Maybe we didn't have all the answers. Maybe we didn't know what the future would bring. But in that moment, I knew that what we had was real, and it was enough to carry us forward, even if we couldn't see the full path ahead. Over the next few days, Richard and I continued to spend time together, but there was a new quietness to our conversations. We weren't avoiding the issue, but it seemed like we both knew that time would tell what came next. We didn't need to rush things or try to solve everything all at once. We just needed to be present, to honor what we had without worrying about the future. And for once, it felt okay to let go of the fear of what was coming. We could only take it one day at a time. As time passed, Richard and I found a rhythm, a balance between our moments of silence and the deep, thoughtful conversations that seemed to fill the spaces between us. It was like we were living in a bubble, separate from the rest of the world, where our connection was something we both understood, even if we couldn't quite explain it. The mornings were peaceful, with the soft light of dawn filling the room. We'd share coffee on the porch. No words needed, just the comfort of being near each other. It wasn't about rushing forward. It was about being present in the quiet moments. But life wasn't without its challenges. The more time we spent together, the more I realized that the day would eventually come when Richard's wife, Emily, would return. And when she did, things would change. I didn't know what that would look like, or how Richard would navigate it, but we both knew that this wasn't something that could stay hidden forever. I think we both tried to delay thinking about it for as long as possible, not wanting to ruin what we had. The nights together, the easy companionship, the moments of intimacy we shared, those were the things we held on to. But the question still loomed. What would happen when everything came to light? One night, as we sat together on his porch, Richard turned to me with a quiet expression. "Kyle," he began, his voice steady but serious, "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. Emily will be back soon, and we can't keep pretending that nothing's happening. I don't know what the right thing is, but I do know that what we've had is real." I nodded slowly, feeling a pang of uncertainty in my chest. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Richard," I said softly. "I don't want to be the reason things fall apart, but I also don't want to walk away from this, from what we have." Richard's gaze softened, and he reached out to take my hand. "I don't want to walk away from it either," he said. "But we need to figure this out. We need to be honest with ourselves and with Emily. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I can't live in this space of not knowing anymore." The air between us was thick with emotion, and I knew that this conversation was long overdue. Richard and I had built something together, something that felt too important to ignore, and yet we couldn't ignore the reality that Emily's return would bring. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "We don't have to have all the answers right now, but we can't keep pretending like nothing's changed. We'll take it one step at a time together." Richard squeezed my hand, and for a moment, everything felt like it would be okay. We didn't know what would happen next, but we knew we would face it together. There was a sense of resolution in the air, a quiet understanding that this was the beginning of something new for both of us, whether it was easy or not. The following days were filled with a quiet anticipation. I kept my distance, not wanting to intrude too much while Richard made the preparations he needed. The uncertainty of the situation hung in the air, but as I looked at Richard, I saw a calm in him that wasn't there before. He was ready to face whatever came next. When Emily returned, it was as we both had expected. There was an awkwardness in the air, a sense of unspoken tension, but Richard handled it with a quiet grace that left me in awe. He was honest with her, as difficult as it was, and though it wasn't easy, it was a step toward clarity. I wasn't part of that conversation, but I knew Richard had done what was necessary. I wasn't sure where things would go from there, but I knew that whatever came next, we had started something real. Richard and I didn't know what the future held, but we had both learned something important in this experience. We had learned to face our truths, to embrace what we wanted, and to be open to what the future might bring. And as I stood there, watching him navigate his world with newfound clarity, I realized that whatever came next, I would be there for him. The night of Emily's return, Richard and I stood outside, the cool night air brushing against our skin. We didn't speak much, but there was a quiet understanding between us. Whatever the future held, we had made a choice, and we would face it together. Richard turned to me, his eyes soft. "Thank you," he said quietly. For being here, for understanding. I smiled, my heart full. I'm not going anywhere. And as we stood there, side by side, the world seemed a little less uncertain. There was still a lot to figure out, but for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with the journey ahead.